The café door creaked as Daniel pushed it open, guiding his little girl in front of him, with a gentle hand on her shoulder. The place was alive with the sounds of cups clinking, conversations bubbling, and the low hum of a weekend morning crowd. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, spilling onto tables where families laughed over stacks of pancakes and friends leaned close across mugs of steaming coffee. It was the kind of place where everyone seemed to belong, everyone except Daniel. Or at least, that was how it felt whenever the whisper started. He looked out of place among the polished couples and well-dressed families. His jeans were faded and fraying at the edges, his jacket worn from years of use. His boots, though sturdy, carried the dust of too many long days on construction sites. His hair was uncombed, his jaw shadowed with the stubble of a man who had been too tired to care that morning. He wasn't sloppy, but he carried the weight of someone who lived in survival mode rather than comfort. Beside him, Emily clutched a small pink backpack against her chest. She was 8 years old, with a messy braid already falling apart, strands of golden, brown hair slipping free to frame her face. Her sneakers were scuffed, the toes marked from playground adventures, but her smile was enough to make her father's exhaustion worth it. To him, she was light in a world that had often been dark. They found a small table near the back. Daniel pulled out the chair for his daughter first, then sat opposite her. He tried to shake off the feeling of eyes on him, but he was used to it. There was something about being a single father that drew stares. Pity from some, judgment from others, and disbelief from many more. People thought men weren't built to raise children alone, that mothers had the magic touch, while fathers fumbled and failed. He had heard it all. And still, he showed up day after day for Emily. "Pancakes or waffles, kiddo?" he asked, flipping open the menu. "Pancakes," she said quickly, her eyes bright. "With strawberries, please." "Strawberries it is." He smiled and flagged down a waitress, placing their order. His voice was low, polite, never drawing attention. He had learned to make himself small in public, to avoid confrontation, to keep Emily shielded from unnecessary cruelty. But no matter how hard he tried, the whispers always found them. At the next table, a woman leaned toward her friend, her voice low but not low enough. He looked so lost. Poor child, having a man raise her all alone. You can tell he doesn't know what he's doing. Her friend chuckled, sipping her coffee. "Look at her hair. It's barely holding together. He probably doesn't even know how to braid." Daniel's jaw tightened. He kept his eyes on Emily, pretending not to hear, but their words sank into him like stones. He was used to it, yes, but used to it didn't mean immune. Every whisper was another reminder of the silent war he fought, proving to himself and the world that he was enough for his daughter. Emily shifted in her seat, tugging at the loose strands of her braid. She had heard them too. She dropped her eyes to the table, suddenly quiet. That silence from her hurt more than anything anyone could say. Daniel reached across the table and gently tilted her chin up with his hand. "Hey," he whispered, forcing a smile. "Don't listen to that. You know I'm still practicing with the braids. I'll get it right one of these days. Just give me a little more time." She nodded, though her eyes still glistened. She wanted to believe him, and she did. But the sting of being judged so openly was hard to shake off when you were only 8 years old. The food arrived a few minutes later, and Emily's face lit up at the sight of the pancakes, stacked high with strawberries. Daniel relaxed slightly, grateful for the distraction. He cut the pancakes for her, careful to make neat pieces, and pushed the plate closer. She giggled softly when he pretended to steal a strawberry, and for a moment, the heaviness lifted. But the whispers began again. At another table, a couple smirked as they watched Daniel awkwardly try to tie Emily's hair back after she leaned too close to her syrup. His large, calloused hands, hands that had once gripped rifles and carried the weight of injured comrades across battlefields, struggled with the delicate strands. The elastic snapped from his fingers, flying to the floor. The couple laughed quietly, shaking their heads. Hopeless. The man muttered under his breath. Daniel heard it this time. His shoulders stiffened, and he bent to pick up the elastic. He tried again, fumbling, determined not to let his frustration show in front of Emily. She watched him silently, her little eyes wide, torn between embarrassment and love. "Almost got it," he murmured. "Just need a little more patience." The braid was uneven, loose, but he managed to secure it enough to keep the hair out of her syrup. Emily gave him a small smile, and that was enough for him. He didn't care how perfect it looked. He cared that she knew he tried. Still, the judgment in the air was thick. Every chuckle, every side glance was another knife to his pride. He wondered, not for the first time, if people would ever understand the truth. They saw only a man fumbling with hair ties, not the man who stayed awake night after night to comfort a child crying for her mother. They saw only the scuffed boots, not the hours he spent working double shifts so Emily never went without food or school supplies. They saw weakness where there was strength, clumsiness where there was sacrifice. He wanted to tell them, to shout it in their faces. That love didn't always look graceful. That parenting didn't have to be perfect to be powerful. But Daniel had learned long ago to swallow his pride and keep his battles private. Just as he forced himself to breathe through the shame, the cafe door opened with a sharp, commanding creak. The sound of boots against the wooden floor cut through the hum of chatter. Heads turned instinctively, conversations faltered, and even the waitresses paused in their tracks. A tall figure filled the doorway. The uniform he wore gleamed under the light, adorned with medals and ribbons that spoke of years of service. His posture was straight, his presence magnetic, the kind that drew respect without a word. He carried himself with the weight of authority, the kind that silenced rooms. Daniel didn't look up at first. He was too focused on wiping syrup from Emily's chin, but the hush that fell over the cafe was impossible to ignore. He raised his eyes slowly, and when he did, his breath caught. The general's gaze swept across the room, scanning faces until it landed on him. Recognition flickered instantly. Without hesitation, the man strode across the cafe, his boots striking the floor like a drumbeat. Every head turned to follow him, the air tense with curiosity. Daniel froze. Emily looked between them, confused. And then, in front of the entire cafe, the general stopped at their table, straightened, and lifted his hand in a sharp salute. The mocking faces, the whispers, the chuckles, they all evaporated in an instant. Silence hung heavy. Every pair of eyes fixed on the single dad, who suddenly wasn't just a struggling father anymore. He was something far more than anyone in that room had guessed. Daniel swallowed hard, his chest tightening as memories surged back. He rose slowly from his chair, unsure if this was a dream or reality. The general's hand remained at his brow, the gesture unwavering, filled with respect that cut deeper than any insult ever could. Emily stared at her father with wide eyes, her small voice breaking the silence. "Daddy, why is he saluting you?" Daniel had no answer yet. But in that moment, as the weight of the general's respect settled over him, he knew one thing for certain: the whispers of strangers no longer mattered. The room was so silent you could have heard a spoon drop. Every whisper that had cut into Daniel, just moments before, now dissolved into stunned quiet. The general's salute hung in the air like a command carved in stone, immovable and undeniable. His presence filled the cafe, radiating a gravity that made the laughter from before seem childish and cruel. Daniel rose to his feet slowly, uncertain, the wooden chair scraping softly against the floor. He was taller than most men, But in that instant, he felt small compared to the figure before him. The general's eyes bore into his, sharp and steady, but carrying a warmth of recognition that made Daniel's throat tighten. "Sergeant Daniels," the general said, his voice a deep timbre that carried authority even in the quietest tone. "It's an honor to see you." The words were simple, but they echoed through the café, rippling through every person in the room. Emily's head snapped toward her father, confusion and wonder flashing across her face. She tugged lightly at his sleeve, whispering, "Daddy, he knows you." Daniel nodded faintly, his chest heavy with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He extended his hand toward the general, who clasped it firmly, their grip strong, unshaken, the kind of handshake forged only in shared battlefields and blood. The general's eyes softened. "You may not wear the uniform anymore, but men like you never fade from memory. I'll never forget what you did." Daniel tried to find words, but his throat felt clogged. It wasn't often he was at a loss for speech, but the flood of memories, the roar of gunfire, the acrid smell of smoke, the cries of wounded men in the night, rushed back too quickly. He tightened his jaw, struggling to keep control in front of Emily. The general turned slightly, his gaze sweeping over the patrons, his voice lifting with quiet conviction. "For those of you who don't know, this man saved lives. More than I can count. He carried 3 wounded soldiers across open ground, under fire, without hesitation. Men are alive today because of him. He doesn't just understand sacrifice, he embodies it." Murmurs rippled through the café, but they weren't the cruel whispers from before. These were hushed words of shock, disbelief, and dawning respect. Eyes that once rolled in mockery now widened with shame. A few people looked down at their cups, unable to meet Daniel's eyes. Emily's little hand slipped into her father's, clutching tightly. She stared up at him with new light in her eyes, her voice trembling with awe. "Daddy, why didn't you ever tell me?" Daniel knelt down to her level, his heart breaking and swelling all at once. He brushed a strand of hair from her face and spoke softly, so only she could hear. "Because the battles I fought out there don't matter as much as the one I fight every day here. With you. Raising you, keeping you safe, giving you love. That's the most important mission I'll ever have." Her eyes shimmered, and she threw her arms around his neck, hugging him tight. For the first time, the braid in her hair didn't matter, the whispers didn't matter. She knew who her father truly was. The general gave them a moment before speaking again, this time directly to the room. His voice grew firmer, the kind of tone that demanded attention and obedience. "I want you all to understand something. What you see here isn't just a man struggling with his daughter's hair or figuring out breakfast. What you see is a hero, one who has faced death, loss, and unimaginable hardship, and who now fights the hardest fight of all, raising a child alone. That takes more courage than most people will ever know." The words pierced through the silence like arrows. A woman who had whispered cruelly earlier shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her cheeks flushed. The couple who had laughed at Daniel's fumbling with the hair tie lowered their gazes, shame prickling at their skin. Nobody dared to speak. Nobody dared to smirk. Daniel straightened, still holding Emily close. He felt exposed, raw, as though someone had stripped away the walls he had built to keep his past buried. Yet, in the general's words, there was also a strange relief. For so long, he had carried the weight of being misunderstood, the loneliness of people never seeing beyond his stumbles. Now, for once, someone had spoken the truth aloud. Emily looked up at the general with wide, curious eyes. "You were with my daddy in the army." The general crouched slightly, so he wasn't towering over her. His expression softened, his voice gentler. "Yes, little one. I had the honor of serving alongside him." And your father was one of the bravest men I ever knew. He never thought about himself, only about protecting others." Emily's lips curved into a proud smile. She hugged her father again, whispering, "I'm proud of you, Daddy." Daniel closed his eyes, holding her tightly, as if to shield her from every harsh word that had ever been spoken. Tears threatened to fall, but he fought them back. Not here. Not in front of all these people. But inside, his heart cracked open with a mixture of pain and healing he hadn't expected to feel. The general stood, addressing Daniel once more, his voice quieter but no less firm. "You may not wear the uniform anymore, Sergeant, but never doubt, you're still serving. In a different way, yes, but perhaps the most important way of all. Don't let anyone make you feel less than what you are." Daniel swallowed hard, his voice rough when he finally spoke. "Thank you, sir. I don't deserve." "Yes, you do." The general cut in firmly. "You deserve every ounce of respect. Don't forget it." The general gave one last sharp nod before stepping back. The café remained silent, the weight of his words lingering in the air. People shifted in their seats, some offering Daniel quick, apologetic glances. One older man even muttered, "Didn't know. God bless you, son." But Daniel didn't care about their change of heart. What mattered was Emily's face, beaming, glowing with pride, her small hands holding tightly onto his. For years, she had only seen him as Dad, the man who sometimes burned dinner and fumbled with braids. Now she saw him as something more, something larger than life. And though Daniel wished he could shield her from the pain of judgment, he also knew this moment was teaching her something: strength, dignity, and the truth that love carried more weight than anyone's opinion. As the general walked toward the door, the café's silence followed him. He paused briefly, looked back at Daniel, and gave him one last nod of respect before leaving. The door closed behind him, the echo of his boots fading into the distance. The room began to breathe again, but it was different now. The laughter that once mocked was gone. In its place hung an unspoken acknowledgement, a silent apology that no words could express. Daniel sat down again, Emily climbing onto his lap this time, still holding him tightly as though afraid he might disappear. "Daddy," she whispered softly into his ear. "I don't care what anyone says anymore. You're my hero." His throat burned, but he smiled through it, pressing a kiss against her forehead. "That's all I'll ever need to hear, sweetheart." And as he held her close, the weight of the world on his shoulders felt just a little lighter. For the first time in a long time, Daniel believed it, not just in his past as a soldier, but in his present as a father. He wasn't failing. He wasn't fumbling. He was fighting. And he was winning in the only way that truly mattered. The air in the café lingered heavy, even after the general's departure, as though the silence he left behind had seeped into the walls and taken root. People still whispered, but not in the same way as before. Their voices carried no laughter, no judgment, only guilt, curiosity, or quiet respect. Some avoided looking at Daniel altogether, while others glanced his way, as if trying to undo the harm their eyes and words had inflicted earlier. But Daniel barely noticed them. His world had shrunk down to the little girl, curled against his chest, her small arms locked around his neck, as though holding on to the one unshakable anchor in her life. "Daddy," Emily whispered softly, her voice muffled by his shirt. "Are you really a hero?" Daniel exhaled slowly, his hand smoothing over her hair, careful not to disturb the uneven braid he had done earlier. His throat felt tight. He wanted to answer in a way that would both tell her the truth and protect her innocence. He thought of the men he had carried across enemy fire, of the lives saved, and the ones lost. He thought of nights under foreign skies, clutching a rifle and praying to make it through until dawn. But more than that, he thought of the nights since, when Emily's cries for her mother had pierced him deeper than any bullet ever had. "I don't know about being a hero," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "I just did what needed to be done back then. And now, I'm doing what needs to be done for you. That's all." She lifted her head, her eyes glistening as she searched his face. "But he said you were brave. That you save people. That means you're a hero." Daniel gave her a small smile, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Maybe. But the truth is, Emily, the bravest thing I've ever done is learning how to be your dad. That's harder than anything I faced before." Her little lips curved into a smile, shy but glowing with pride. She settled back against him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Daniel felt the weight of her love outweigh the weight of the world pressing on his shoulders. As they finished their breakfast, the waitress came over quietly, setting down a small plate with an extra strawberry shortcake on it. "For your daughter," she said softly, almost shyly. "On the house." She didn't explain further, didn't need to. Her eyes carried the apology that her words couldn't quite form. Emily's face lit up, and Daniel gave the waitress a grateful nod. For once, he didn't feel pity in the gesture, he felt respect. The simple act of kindness chipped away at the memory of laughter that had echoed in the same room less than an hour before. When they finally stepped outside into the crisp air, the morning sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Emily slipped her hand into Daniel's automatically, her small fingers fitting perfectly between his calloused ones. He felt her grip tighter than usual, as though she was holding on not just for safety, but for pride. The world outside bustled with weekend life, cars rushing past, children tugging their parents toward toy stores, couples strolling arm in arm. But for Daniel, everything felt changed. The general's salute still played over in his mind, as vivid as if it had been carved into stone. That single gesture had shattered years of silence, exposing parts of his past he had buried and reminding him that the battles he fought had not been forgotten. As they walked home, Emily swung his hand lightly, her laughter carrying in the air like music. She glanced up at him every few steps, her eyes glowing with the kind of admiration that made Daniel's chest ache. "Daddy," she said suddenly, "can I tell people at school that you're a hero?" He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You can tell them whatever you want, kiddo. But if they ask me, I'll just say I'm your dad. That's the best title I'll ever have." Her smile widened, and she skipped a little, humming to herself. When they reached their small apartment, Daniel unlocked the door and let Emily rush in first. She dropped her backpack on the couch and pulled out her crayons, immediately settling on the floor to draw. Daniel stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching in her hair, and he thought about all the sacrifices that had led to this. Working double shifts, eating less so she could have more, pushing his body beyond exhaustion just to keep the lights on. None of it had been easy, but seeing her sitting there, safe and smiling, made every battle worth it. Later that evening, as Daniel cooked dinner, a simple meal of pasta and sauce, Emily sat at the table, coloring furiously. When he finally placed the plates down, she slid a sheet of paper across to him. On it was a crayon drawing, a little girl holding hands with a man in a soldier's uniform. Above them, in big, uneven letters, she had written, "My dad, my hero." Daniel's throat closed up as he stared at it. The crude lines, the wobbly letters, the colors spilling outside the shapes. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He reached across the table, pulling her into his arms, holding her as tightly as he could. She giggled, protesting that he was squishing her, but hugged him back just as fiercely. That night, after Emily was asleep, Daniel sat alone at the kitchen table. the drawing propped against a glass of water. He traced the lines with his eyes, letting the pride and love sink into him. For years, he had convinced himself he was failing, that every fumbled braid and burnt meal proved the whispers right. But now, for the first time, he allowed himself to believe otherwise. He wasn't perfect, but perfection had never been the goal. He was present. He was trying. And in Emily's eyes, that was more than enough. Days passed, and the change was subtle but undeniable. At the café, people no longer whispered when he walked in. Instead, they nodded, greeted him politely, even smiled at Emily. The same couple who had once laughed at his fumbling now offered a quiet "Good morning" when they saw him. The woman who had whispered about his daughter's hair complimented Emily's smile one day. Daniel didn't forget their cruelty, but he didn't hold on to it either. He accepted the shift not for himself, but for Emily, so she would see kindness where once there had been judgment. For Emily, the change was even more profound. She walked into school with her head held higher, her stories about her father carrying new weight. When classmates asked about him, she no longer hesitated. She told them proudly, "My dad is strong. He saved people, and he takes care of me." Her voice no longer trembled with doubt. It rang with certainty. Daniel noticed it in her eyes too. When she looked at him now, she didn't just see the man who tucked her in at night or packed her lunch. She saw someone larger than life, someone who had fought battles not just on distant soil but here, in their everyday lives. And though Daniel sometimes wished she didn't need to see him that way, he also knew it gave her strength. One evening, as they walked home from the park, the sky painted in hues of orange and purple, Emily slipped her hand into his and looked up at him with a quiet smile. "Daddy," she said softly, "when I grow up, I want to be strong like you." Daniel's steps faltered, the weight of her words settling deep in his chest. He looked down at her, his heart swelling with both love and humility. He bent slightly, kissing the top of her head. "You already are, sweetheart," he whispered. "You already are." They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence, the world around them fading into the background. For Daniel, the battle was far from over. There would always be struggles, always challenges. But in that moment, he knew he had already won the most important war of his life. He had kept his promise to Emily. He had given her love, protection, and hope. And though the world had once mocked him, though strangers had once reduced him to whispers and laughter, Daniel now walked forward with his daughter, head high, heart strong, knowing that in her eyes, he would forever be a hero.